Chris and Sarah, when Caroline and I got married for our honeymoon, we went on a cruise, and during the course of that week, we discovered there were some experiences on that cruise that we just loved. One of which was this chocolate dessert. Every night the menu, there were major components of it that were different entrees, different soups, different salads, different everything. But when it came to dessert time, there were some differences every night, but there were a few things that were on the menu every night. And I don't remember what this one chocolate thing was called, but it was just amazing. I mean, all I know is if the children of Israel in the wilderness got this, they wouldn't have complained. So anyway, we loved that, but we also loved this pair of older ladies from London that we had met early in the week. And we'd actually met when we were off the ship at one of the ports of call, and then we discovered we're on the same boat. And just over the course of the week, we got to spend a lot of time with them, and they were just delightful. Loved to hear their British accents, loved to hear their stories. And we shared a couple of meals with them. And so the last night of the cruise, though, we'd planned that we were going to have dinner with these two ladies. In all likelihood, and I'm sure now, in fact, they might have already passed on, but we figured this is probably not only our last chance to see them, but maybe the last time to see them ever. So we had this meal with them, and so we've had the various courses of the meal have come out, and then your server comes over to take your dessert order. And so Caroline and I know this is our last chance to get this chocolate dessert. And as the server is asking us what we want, this chocolate, whatever it is, it's on our lips. But before we can get it out, one of these British ladies says, "We'll all have the cheesecake." And as soon as she says that, he scurries off to the kitchen. And all I'm thinking is this. I mean, I don't hate cheesecake, but I don't love cheesecake. I'm like, whoop-de-doo. I mean, it's so wonderful, it's so wonderful. It's cheesecake. It's just cheesecake. It's not this chocolate thing. I don't want the cheesecake. I want the chocolate thing. But now here is my reality. There is a choice that I have not made that I am now experiencing the consequences of, and I've got to figure out how I deal with this. So a choice that someone else has made, now I'm facing the consequences of that, and so how do I navigate this? More specifically, how do I navigate this with them? As an aside, what we did was to order a second dessert, in case you're wondering. Anyway, my point in sharing that is to say this. There was a choice that someone else made that led us to experience consequences, a choice that we didn't want them to make, but they did it anyway. Now I've got to figure out, what do I do now? We've been in a series that I've been calling The Bible, the Birds, and the Bees, and we've been talking about some important and candidly some very controversial issues in our society and our culture today, thinking about how it is as a follower of Christ we can operate as Christians, as followers of God, from a biblical ethic, from a biblical morality. How do we do this in a society that's headed in the opposite direction? Last week, actually 2 weeks ago, because I was out of town last week, we were in Romans 1 and talking about the issue of homosexuality. And if you weren't here, my encouragement for you is to go online. You can watch the video of that, and you can see everything that was said during that day. But let me just summarize what God, through Paul, says in Romans 1 about homosexuality. God views it as being out of bounds, unacceptable deviation from His plan for human sexuality. That it's sin. No more, no less. That's exactly what it is. It's a deviation from His plan, and in no way is God even remotely, hear me in this, God is not even remotely accepting of or tolerant of this. God unequivocally, it's out of bounds. Clear as black and white, clear as black letters on white paper. So the reason we did that message first is because that serves as the foundation. We have to remind ourselves and ask ourselves, what does God say about this? Because culture and society is saying a lot. Academia, from collegiate level all the way down to elementary and even preschool, they're saying a lot about these issues, but what does God say about this? So we have to figure out and answer the question, what has God said? And bear in mind, God has been very clear, and He's been consistent both in the left and the right-hand sides of the Bible about what He feels about this issue. And so we have to figure out what God has said, and then we answer this question, am I going to stand with God on this issue? Am I going to have the courage? Am I going to have the wherewithal? Am I going to have the conviction to stand in concert with God on this issue? My hope is that you would say yes, but we need to be reminded where the foundations are. So we did that. The difficult part, though, is not figuring out what God has said about the issue. Because, again, God has been consistently clear over and over and over and over again. There is no ambiguity. I mean, the only way that you can say that the Bible approves of this is to get your scissors out and literally cut out hunks out of your Bible. All right? That's the easy part, is to figure out what God has said about it. Here's the difficult part. I've got someone, or you've got someone in your life who is making the choice and the decision. They are living this lifestyle out. Maybe it's a son. Maybe it's a daughter. Maybe it's a grandchild. Maybe it's a close friend. Maybe it's a close coworker that you just love and respect and value. But this is the path that they're going down. As a follower of God, if I know what God has said about this, how do I deal with them? What do I do with this? I know God has said this is where He is. I want to stand with Him, but now how do I relate to this person? That's where the brass tacks for many of you. This is where the rubber meets the road. How do we deal with this? Now, the Bible does not give us a whole slew of passages that deal with every specific that we're going to experience. But what the Bible consistently does is to communicate to us in a variety of different ways some principles that we can apply to the specific circumstances that we are facing, including even this one. So if you have some with respect to the issue of homosexuality that is going down that path, you care for them, you love them, but you also know what God has said about this, and you want to stand with God, but you want to know how to relate to them, what do? The Bible answers that question, I believe, today through some principles that we see in Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15, if you would look with me there in your Bibles today, it is a parable that Jesus shared that, again, and let me be very clear, this is not a passage that talks about a father with a gay son. This is a passage, though, that communicates some principles that, whether this is the specific challenge you're facing or some other one, that communicates some principles about how you, as a follower of God that wants to stand with Him on this issue, how you deal with and relate to them. Luke chapter 15, starting with verse 11. We're told by Jesus that a man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the estate I have coming to me." So he distributed the assets to them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered together all he had and traveled to a distant country where he squandered his estate in foolish, or some translations say prodigal, living. After he had spent everything, a severe famine struck that country, and he had nothing. Then he went to work for one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his field to feed the pigs. He longed to eat his fill from the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one would give him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired workers have more than enough food, and here I am dying of hunger? I'll get up, go to my father, and say to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired workers.' So he got up and he went to his father. But while the son was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran, threw his arms around his neck, and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father told his servant, 'Quick, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals in his feet.' And he began to celebrate." Again, this is not a passage that talks about a father with a gay son. But it is a passage that I believe God uses to communicate some principles to us that will help us to navigate those waters as those that are His followers that are trying to take what He has said seriously. Now, before going further, let me just very briefly deal with this question, because a couple of times already I have used, with respect to the word homosexuality, I've used the word choice. Some of you might have even recoiled or noticed that, and so we're left with this question: are people born gay? Is it possible, from a biblical perspective, for someone to struggle with same-sex attraction? Let me answer that question definitively. I don't know. And for the longest time, honestly, as conservative evangelicals, we were petrified if somehow there could be some sort of genetic link that would show a propensity towards homosexuality. But in truth, we shouldn't have been afraid of that at all, because this is what I want you to understand. Every behavior that you undertake ultimately is a choice. With regard to sexual behavior, every one of those behaviors is reflective of a choice. Take the homo part out of the equation. Just look at heterosexual sexual ethics. Just because someone has the desire for heterosexual behavior does not mean that they may have those desires in God-approved ways. They may want to engage in sex outside of marriage, whether that is pre-marriage or extramarital. That's out of bounds. But they have that desire. So does that desire make the behavior wrong? No. No, it doesn't. So ultimately, I believe we're left with this position. Whether or not it is that people actually come into this world and have a propensity towards or a bent towards some particular behavior with respect to sexual ethics, does that excuse or somehow make the behavior acceptable? Absolutely not, because every single one of us, in this aspect of our lives as well as every other aspect, we have to make a choice. So, again, what do we do with this? Let's start to unpack what's going on. Again, you are probably familiar with this passage. We call it the parable of the prodigal son. You've got a guy who has two sons, an older and a younger son. And early on in this passage, there's something that sounds fairly obscure or unusual, because he's asking for his share of the estate, asking for his portion of the inheritance. And so when we hear the word inheritance, we think, well, someone has died. But what was something that was not particularly common, but it wasn't unheard of in the first century is this. If you, for example, were a son of your or daughter of your parents, you could effectively sell your rights to your share of the estate. As the younger son, he would have been entitled to 1/3. The older brother gets a double portion, in this case, 2/3 of the estate. So let's say the younger son is entitled, among other things, to 100 head of cattle. What he could do is to go and say to someone, listen, when my dad dies, 100 head of cattle are coming to me. If you give me 10 grand now, when my father dies, you get 100 head of cattle that are worth 18 grand. I get my money now, you get your cows later. So people could do that. And so when this passage talks about the father being approached by the younger son wanting his share of the estate, it sounds ultimately what is going on is that he's asking for an accounting. What should belong to me when you pass? What can you show me the ledger sheet? What's going to be coming to me? And then he would go and sell the rights to that. So at this point, he's done that. He's got a fat wad of cash in his pocket, and that money is burning a hole in his pocket, and he wants to get out of Daddy's house, and we're told that not many days later, he gathers all that he had, and he travels to a distant country. Why does he want to go to a distant country? I think because, and the context bears it out, he wants to make some decisions and some choices that Daddy's not going to like. And so he goes and he begins to do this. And we're told that he began to use this money on wasteful or prodigal living. All right, so let me give you the first application. You can influence decisions, but you cannot make choices for others. You can influence decisions, but you cannot make choices for others. The passage does not tell us this, but it seems pretty clear. I think context logically would lead us to recognize this. This younger son is making decisions and choices that the father does not approve of. He is making some decisions and choices that are out of bounds. In fact, it's almost certain in this scenario that when the son is asking his father for his share of the inheritance, hey, can you give me a tally of what belongs to me? You've just got to think that the father would say, listen, son, please don't do this. You are making a colossal mistake. This is an egregious error. I'm telling you, this is going to cost you for the rest of your life. Please do not do this. Those of you who are in the active stages of parenting like Caroline and myself now, you understand and hopefully are reminded of this fact that we have, especially when you're in the active stages of parenting, when you've got younger children, that we are presented with phenomenal opportunities and responsibilities to help create a foundation, to help shape and mold decisions and choices that our kids will make. At this point, I mean, our youngest is 6 months, our oldest is 13. Obviously, the 13-year-old can make a lot more decisions than the 3-year-old, but nevertheless, there's still a whole slew of decisions that's not even on the table of possibility. They can't, it's not even up for grabs whether they can make that decision or not. But as they grow, and especially as they get to the point they go off to college, they leave the home, the ability for us to control their decisions, what is happening is that window gets smaller and smaller and smaller and finally is closed. And especially once they've left the house, there's so much that you can't decide. You can't control. You can't dictate. But the best that you can do is what? You can influence. You can nudge. You can encourage. You can remind. I recognize as your kids are aging, and those of you who are further down the road, you understand in ways that I haven't experienced yet. But hopefully we all understand this, that over time that window closes, but it doesn't mean that influence goes away. I believe sincerely that this father would have said to the son, please do not do this. He's going to try to help him see all the cards that are on the table. I don't believe the father would have been like, oh, okay, yeah, 50 grand is what you're entitled to. I don't think he did that at all. My strong suspicion is that he did what you would have done, which is to say, listen, I'm telling you, this is the dumbest thing you could do. This is a life-alteringly bad decision. You're going to be sending yourself down a road that you can't fully come back from. Please don't do this. Please think about that. Let's talk through this. But at the end of the day, he could not make his son's decision. He could not make the choice for his son. He could influence, but that's the extent of it. You have to, and some of you may be sitting there with respect to your own particulars. Maybe you have a child that is struggling with these issues or has already made the choice and going down this path. And maybe you're sitting there beating yourself up thinking, what could I have done? How can this happen? What can I do to alter this? At the end of the day, while you are still in the active stages of parenting, remember the opportunities and the responsibilities that are entrusted to your care. But remind yourself also, at the end of the day, you are not raising children, you're raising adults. You're raising a man, you're raising a woman that will eventually make their own choices that you can nudge, you can influence, but you cannot control. Sometimes we just need to be reminded of that. But the story continues. The younger son has squandered, according to verse 13, his estate in foolish living. In fact, if you were to read the full story, you see by the time he gets back home, the older son complains about him and says, among other things, that his younger brother spent money on prostitutes. So in broad brushstrokes, what we're communicating or receiving communication of is that you've got a guy that is partying like there is no tomorrow. I mean, he goes into the bar and say, hey, everybody, the drinks are on me. That he is trying to buy friends, that he is trying to candidly buy sexual activity. He is partying like it's 1999, and there is no turning back. He is having the time of his life, and he is just making it rain with all this fat wad of cash that's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. But to make matters worse, a famine strikes the area. Hopefully you're aware of basic economics. When supply diminishes, demand increases, and as demand increases, so does the price. So a famine strikes the area, and so that means that with this little bit of money, he can buy even less. Cost of bread, cost of grain, cost of corn, cost of everything goes through the roof. And so the little bit of money that he has left is now no longer even enough to sustain him. In fact, it gets to a point where he winds up having to accept a job that as a Jew would have been the most demeaning, the most humiliating of things, and that's effectively slop hogs. And he's thinking to himself, I don't even have the food to eat that these pigs do. And what happens? That leads us to the second application, which is this. Do not enable bad choices or mitigate their consequences. Let me just tell you, this particular point is the most pivotal in everything you'll hear me say this morning. So let me say it again. Do not enable bad choices or mitigate the consequences of those bad choices. Pay attention to what's going on. In verse 17, it begins with this statement of the prodigal son, when he came to his senses. Some of your translations say, when he came to himself. So when he finally gets to the point that he realizes, I am making a colossal mess of me. I have made egregious, enormous, terrible choices. When he finally sees himself and he sees his choices for what they are, let me just say to you, if you have a loved one that is headed down the wrong path, that's exactly what you want them to experience. Again, you can't make the choice for them. You can nudge, you can encourage, you can try to remind them of information, but you can't make the choices. What you want them to do is to finally wake up, to finally get to the point where they say, as they look in the mirror, what is that? And the scales come off of their eyes and finally decide, I need to start doing things differently and ultimately respond to the invitation of God. Bear in mind, that's the goal. So here's the question. How do we get there? More specifically, how did the prodigal son get there? It's easy to miss, but I'm telling you, this is enormously important. Pay attention to what's going on. You've got this younger son that is just barreling away from God, away from his father, making terrible, colossal decisions. He's got his foot to the floor, getting away from God as far and as fast as possible. And the goal is for him to realize what he's doing before it becomes too late. But what gets him there? Why does he come to his senses? It's because of this. He was allowed to experience the full weight of the consequences of his choices. Did this mean that his father did not love him? No. Did this mean that the people in that country hated him? No. Pay attention again to what goes on. The younger son leaves the father. He's got this fat wad of cash and he's going to waste it. Hanging out with prostitutes, partying like it's 1999. Terrible decisions. What does the father do? Nothing. Does the father leave the house and go and call out his son's name? Does he go to cities and towns where he thinks his son may be? No. Does he even leave the property? No. Does he ever for a moment stop loving his son? Absolutely not. But what he essentially does is he liberates his son to experience the full weight of his choices. Pay attention, not only does the father do that, notice also in verse 16. He's out there slopping hogs, thinking, man, I wish I even had what the pigs had to eat, but I don't have this. And notice this phrase, no one would give him anything. Whatever town, whatever place, whatever region, wherever it was that he was at, no one gave him anything. Why is that important? Because if Daddy came and threw some money at this situation, if people said, here, let me take you to Golden Corral. If that had happened, what would have occurred? He would have stayed where he was longer. In fact, maybe never even come to his senses. What brings this man to the point where he realizes the mess that he has made is that he gets the full fury of the consequences of his choices. Again, did his father stop loving him? Absolutely not. Did the people in that far country, did they hate him? Absolutely not. But they essentially said what Burger King said, have it your way, all of it. And what happened is that over time, those consequences become greater and greater and greater. And finally, it gets his attention. I'll be honest with you, several years ago, I'd lost a fair chunk of weight, and in the past couple of years, I've found most of it. Wasn't very hard. A lot of it was at Krispy Kreme. Here's the thing. I've been adding some pounds, and I realize I know this. I need to reverse course. I need to do something. I need to start making some different choices. But do you know why I haven't? I'll give you one good reason. My favorite pants have a hidden elastic seam. Size number doesn't change, but they just keep getting a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger, and a little bit bigger. And so if I'm not having to go buy some bigger breeches, do I really have a problem? Are things that bad? No, because the pants just keep getting bigger. What I'm saying to you is that my pants are enabling me to get bigger than I should be. Can we just be honest and say that as people, a lot of times we do that, unfortunately, all too often with the people that are dearest to us, because we believe it to be unloving to let them experience the consequences of choices. Can I just tell you the honest truth? And I realize it's easier to say this than it is to do it. Some of you are further along in the parenting game than Caroline and I are. And so you can speak to this, the personal struggle, in ways that I can't. I get that. But I want to tell you, the most unloving thing that you can do for your children, the most unloving thing that you can do for your grandchildren, the most unloving thing that you can do for that special person in your life is to grease the tracks of their choices that lead them further and further and further from God. We need to hear that. Do not enable bad decisions. Do not make it easier for them to keep making those bad choices. And as they do that, as the consequences begin to be borne out, because, do you know what bad choices produce? Bad consequences. And as those bad consequences begin to be experienced by them, do not come in and throw water on the fire. Let it burn. Because why? Unfortunately, it's true for all of us. Adverse consequences and difficult circumstances teach us like nothing else can. And that's in every aspect of our life. You know, one of the reasons that my kids will behave is because they know that spankings are unpleasant. That teaches. Adverse consequences teach like nothing else ever can. So do not enable bad choices. Do not mitigate their consequences. What I want you to understand is that this is not an isolated principle. In fact, you remember the other week when we were in Romans 1, as that passage concludes down by the time you get to verse 28, Paul says this of God, because you've got this process that has unfolded where you've got men having exchanged the natural use of women for men and women sharing same-sex relations with others. And Paul says in Romans that God gave them over to a corrupt mind so that they do what is not right. Does that mean that God hates these people, these individuals making sexual choices that God has deemed out of bounds? Absolutely not. He does not hate them. He sent Jesus to die for them as much as He did for you. But what God is doing is, in that passage, He is turning them over to the full weight and the full consequences of their decision. Why? Because bad choices bring bad consequences, and bad consequences teach like nothing else can. That's not the only place you see this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, just a terrible thing that's going on in the church at Corinth. You've got a guy that's having an incestuous relationship with his own mother. And you remember Paul says, you need to quit. Why is this going on in the fellowship of God? Why is this nonsense being tolerated? And he says that you need to put this person out. He says, turn them over to Satan for the judgment of the body so that in the end their soul may be saved. So he's saying, listen, what you're doing is you're patting this guy on the back and you're acting like everything is okay, but nothing is okay. Nothing is okay. And by you continuing to be just, it's so good to see you, it's so nice. By you continuing to do this, you're enabling him to keep doing that. If he wants to make those choices, let him do so, but let him do it without your blessing. Let him do that without you enabling and removing the consequences from that. Let him get the full fury of his choices so that in the end, his soul may be saved, that he might come to God and experience ultimately God's plans and purposes for his life. Do not enable bad choices or mitigate their effects. The end goal is that your loved one, like the prodigal son, sees the light, that they turn to God and experience a change that only Jesus can create in them. But this does not happen until a person finally gets to the point where they realize this: I have made a horrible mess of me. I am a train wreck. And I need someone. I need the only one who can fix this. And that does not happen so long as we are oiling the tracks and removing the sting. There are legions of specific circumstances that could possibly now at this point be running through your mind. And so am I suggesting that this parable is saying to you to cut your son or daughter off, cut them out of your life? Is that what I am personally saying to you? That's not what I'm saying to you. But what I am seeking to do is to expose a principle that I believe is communicated, that I believe is very clear, which is, again, do not do anything that enables them to keep making those bad decisions. Do not pull the reins back on consequences. Let them experience all of them. Does that mean that you cut them off? Does that mean that you have to be unloving? Does that mean that you have to do any of these specifics? All I'm saying is, don't enable it, don't mitigate it. Prayerfully ask God, because there's going to be a legion of specific circumstance that you're going to need guidance on. And I promise you, God will guide you if your commitment is to see them come to their senses. And I believe sincerely that He will, but He'll do so, I believe, in keeping with this principle, that bad choices bring bad consequences, and bad consequences teach and correct in ways that nothing else can. The final application I would share with you is this: restoration is the goal, so be willing to extend it. Restoration is the goal, so be willing to extend it. As the parable winds down, the prodigal wants to return home, but he wants to go back home as what? Effectively a slave. It says in verse 17, how many of my father's the hirelings have more than enough food, and here I am literally dying of hunger. So he says, I'm going to get up and I'm going to go to my father, and I'm going to confess. I'm going to say this is what I've done. But notice what his confession is. He says, I'll go to him and say, I've sinned. Where's the first direction of confession? He says, I've sinned against heaven. Isn't that what David in his confession in Psalm 52 did? Where he says, Lord, against you only have I sinned. That ultimately, my sin, your sin, everybody's sin is ultimately first against him. Yes, it then has effects on other people, but he wants to go back and confess his sin before the Lord, and then even in his father's sight, to say, listen, I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Can you make me like one of the hirelings? That's the hope. Can I come back maybe somehow as a slave so that I don't just starve to death a million miles from home? But you know what happens? The passage is really clear. Before the son even gets onto the property, while he's still just kind of a distant outline, the father sees that outline, and that's a very familiar outline. He knows who that is, and he runs to his son. He embraces him. He falls down before him. He hugs his neck. He is so glad to see him. He is thrilled. And what does he do? At that point, does he say, I just want to squeeze your head off. I just want to kill you for doing this. You big dummy, what was the matter with you? I told you so. You schmuck. What were you thinking? Does he berate him? Does he call him names? Does he castigate him for the choices that he's made? He does not. This is how the Father describes it. That which was lost has been found. My son that was effectively dead is alive. And he's ready to throw a party. Does throw a party. He says, bring out a new robe. Put a ring on his finger. Kill the fatted cow. Don't get the skinny cow. Get the good one. Let's have a party. Because he's come back home. Does he come back as a slave? Absolutely, he does not. He's brought back and restored as a son. Again, that reminds us that restoration is the goal, so be willing to extend it. If you want that person in your life that is special to you, whether it's a son, a daughter, a grandchild, a dear friend, if you want them to come to their senses, you have to be also praying for yourself that whenever and if ever they do, that you have the right attitude and that you have the right posture to help them fully get to the point where they are restored. Not beaten, not spat upon, not made to feel lower than dirt, but restored. But bear in mind this: restoration does not mean that nothing has occurred. The son has forfeited his right to the estate. And you know what? That's not going to come back. Those rights have already been sold. Him being restored speaks to the relationship. Doesn't mean that all of a sudden the consequences of bad choices go away. Doesn't mean that there aren't scars. Sometimes there are things that absolutely cannot be undone. And as you are seeking to influence the decisions that your children, your grandchildren, your dear friends are making, remind them of this. Listen, please don't go down this path, because if you do, I'm not saying that God can't forgive you and that you can't be restored, but I am saying this. It won't be like as if this has never happened. You can't just go back and erase everything and act like it never happened. Because choices not only have consequences, they have lasting consequences, and not all of them can be undone. Restoration is the goal, so be willing and be prepared to extend it. For some of you this morning, I am talking in abstract, general terms, but you're thinking in very specific terms. When I talk about a son or a daughter, you're picturing your son or your daughter or your grandchild or your dear friend. What I would want you to understand, first of all, is this. If you are trying to say, and you're asking the question, now what? They're making this decision, this choice, now what do? I want you to understand this. You are not alone. There are others in this room who are experiencing those same struggles, asking those same questions, and some of them candidly feeling like an island unto themselves. Let me say this. I've already had a couple of folks come to me, and I want to say this to you publicly. If you, as a parent, grandparent, friend, you've got someone that you love in your life, and you want to, first of all, know that you're not in this alone, but you want to meet perhaps with some others, that you might just be able to pray together, or maybe say, listen, I need your help trying to navigate this situation. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how to deal with this as a follower of God. How do I deal with them on this? What do I do? Will you please see me afterwards? Will you email me? Will you call me? I've already got at least a couple that have said, I would like to be part of something. If you would like to be part of that as well. I can't tell you exactly what form or fashion it's going to take, but we want to help you as you make these decisions, as you navigate these difficult waters. Because at the end of the day, we're all going to have to deal with people who are also having to deal with us. And sometimes we don't make good decisions. Sometimes we don't make good choices, and we're saying, now what? All I can say to you is this. The God who made you, who has provided a plan and a purpose for us, has revealed to us principles that if we pay attention, we can navigate the choppy waters. Will you bow your heads with me?